Star Trek Discovery Season 3, Episode 11, Su'Kal. We're drawing to a close on the season, so we're going to get to the big plot point of the entire arc, which is the source of the burn and why it happened. A few thoughts about where we've been just prior to this, though. Of course, Giorgio was written out in the last episode, and I think that's an attempt to put Michelle Yeoh's character to spin her off into a Section 31 series, and by placing her back in a different point in the timeline, she can work with Section 31 possibly during the temporal wars, but they did say a time that was prior to the split between the two universes. So that'll be an interesting premise, and I believe that's why they put her there. I've often thought through the years that it would be an interesting premise for a Star Trek series to use the Guardian of Forever and allow a Starfleet crew to pass through time to just investigate or even give time a push, similar to Quantum Leap and Voyagers, possibly crossed with Stargate. So we'll see if that's how they approach this or not. In any case, we move into this last segment of the season where we're going to examine the burn, and the Discovery has gone to the Nebula where the source of the Federation distress signal has come from the Kiev, which is a ship that was crewed by Kelpians, which is very important to Saru. In addition, they believe this is the source of the burn, and they're going to find out why this happened, hopefully. So, a couple things here. When they beam down, the three characters that beam down are Saru, Burnham, and Culber. Now, Burnham going down as well as Saru, it makes sense in some ways, Saru going down, but he's the captain of the ship, so perhaps Tilly as the number one should have led the away team, but because it's Kelpian, Saru went, leaving Tilly in charge of the ship. They're still struggling to place Tilly into a proper arc in this season. They've tried to manipulate the character, and it's not successful for some people because she's an ensign, and a lot don't feel she should be the first officer. I think they're doing this because it's an unexpected choice. And she does have some qualities that would put her there, but you do have to kind of forget some of the things that have happened in the first two seasons to accept this. Also, the writers aren't doing themselves any favors because in the few episodes prior to this, when Tilly has already been named the first officer, they've allowed Burnham to accompany Saru in meetings with Admiral Vance. So it doesn't quite make sense. That should be his first officer there with him instead of Burnham. Burnham is still occupying a position of authority. Yes, she's a commander, but she's been relegated strictly to the science officer position, and to place her in importance before the first officer creates a conflict of interest within the command structure. So that's a bit of an issue. When Burnham, Culber, and Saru beam down to this planet or into the ship, it's very interesting. When we saw The Next Generation in Deep Space Nine, we had strange circumstances sometimes that were like waking dreams or strange scenarios in which the Starfleet personnel found themselves, and they were allegorical situations that were helping them unravel the storyline. So they didn't beam down into a situation that they expected. They beamed down and they were in sort of a surrealistic environment, and they were changed. Burnham had become Trill, Culber appeared to be Bajoran, and Saru was human. They do give an explanation for this, and it's a very cursory explanation the writers give, so that it would be familiar to Su'Kal, who was the child of the doctor that we saw aboard the ship in the hologram earlier. At the time, Saru knew she was pregnant. He knew that's what the red marks on her forehead meant, while Tilly was saying it was radiation. I knew there was something more to it because the fact that the writers felt the need to point that out when we first saw that character a few episodes ago meant that it was more than radiation. You wouldn't need to point that out. That would be something everybody would understand. So Saru didn't let on at the time, but he knew she was pregnant. So it's her child that we're going to find here on the planet and within the confines of the ship. And the explanation for changing the appearance of Burnham, Saru, and Culber is that it would be familiar to the child. Well, why wouldn't a Kelpian be familiar to the child? I think this was really an excuse to allow Doug Jones to appear without his makeup in an episode. And, you can't fault the actor for wanting to be seen in his own appearance. We've had rumblings of that going on with Pedro Pascal in The Mandalorian, him wanting to appear without the helmet. It's an industry, it's their job, it's their career. On the one hand, they have to accept, well, this is what you agreed to, your makeup is part of your character. On the other hand, they are trying to ensure that they will have jobs in the future and they need to get their face out there. So it's one of those things. I'm not buying the cursory explanation they gave us for the change in appearance. But once we get past that, some interesting developments happen here. Saru is very involved in what's going on. He sees an elder, which he had really never experienced, in someone who was much older than he had ever seen before in a Kelpian. The chambers in which they find themselves are very Harry Potter-esque in some ways, with these flying staircases that go to nowhere. There's a creepy phantom creature that's this sea creature that's covered in kelp, and it's what the child, Sukal, has to confront in order to face his fears, and Burnham sees that. Burnham at one point acts as though she's a computer program and she's interacting with Sukal. And it's important to remember that he is still childlike in personality, which I think kind of goes into his name. If you'll bear with me, that if you pronounce the name phonetically, it's Suckle, which goes back to a child in a lot of ways. So I think that wasn't coincidental for me. In any case, while this is all going on the planet and Culber, Burnham, and Saru are being exposed to this radiation, and they have a limited time down there, Tilly has the con, she's in charge of the ship. They have to jump out of the immediate proximity of the planet in order to fix their shields. The intention is to jump back in within 4 hours to get the crew off the planet so that the radiation doesn't affect them. While they are outside that Nebula area, Osira shows up, and we kind of get a throwdown between her and Tilly. Tilly has she has some nice moments here where she's able to exert authority, and Osira challenges that. Ultimately, Osira beams aboard and prevents the Discovery from jumping in, and Osira takes over the ship. So we see her more as the big bad she was maybe intended to be. We haven't seen a lot of her. We've heard a lot about her. There was some speculation that perhaps there was more to Vance than met the eye, that maybe he was actually the bad character, and that could still be the case. We still haven't fully unraveled this. In any case, Osira takes over the Discovery, and they leave the area. Meanwhile, Book has taken his ship and gone in to rescue the crew. Saru tells Burnham she needs to stay behind because of her social skills in helping the child. Burnham tells Saru he's invested and the child has responded to him and he needs to stay behind. So there's a moment there where it's up in the air who's going to stay back. But ultimately, Saru stays back and Culber stays with him in order to guide him and the child, because Culber has some familiarity with what it's like to be alone and he wants to help. This is therapeutic for them, but it's also therapeutic for him. So Book comes in and pulls Burnham off the planet, and by the time they get out of the nebula, the Discovery and Osiris ship are gone. The big revelation here is at one point when Sukal has basically an emotional outburst, it creates a shock wave, which is a similar shock wave to what the burn was, just in a much smaller form. So it's speculated that because this planet is rich in dilithium, which is why the Kelpian ship ultimately was there in the first place, the dilithium, in the fact that Sukal has lived there so long around the dilithium, he's adapted to it, and somehow his emotional outburst creates these shock waves, and that first huge shock wave that was the burn must have been caused by him. It must have been some sort of huge emotional outburst way back when this happened initially. And so the explanation right now, at least for the burn, is that it emanates from Sukal and his emotional outbursts. Very different take on it than we thought. I'm sure most people speculated that there would be a much bigger conspiracy behind the burn than perhaps that it was a being responsible for it. We have seen this before in other genre pieces, Star Trek included. Twilight Zone, Outer Limits have had episodes where a being has been responsible for something like this because they have evolved past what we consider a normal sentient being. And you could look at Gary Mitchell in Where No Man Has Gone Before from Star Trek to see the same type of situation in a lot of ways. We'll have to see how this plays out, because at this moment, the Discovery is gone. Book and Burnham are on their own. Culber and Saru are trapped on the planet, and they're trying to track down Sukal and bring him back with them. if they can be rescued themselves. They only have a day though because of the radiation. So we'll have to see how it plays out. It's an unexpected turn in the storyline, a little strange in some ways. Again, I feel like some of the reasons for what we saw weren't necessarily plot-driven reasons, but perhaps actor-driven reasons. And the writers are still struggling a little bit to sort out what they want to do with Tilly and how they want to approach Saru as we move forward. And again, Giorgio's character alluded to the fact that Burnham is a captain too, at heart at least, down deep. She should be a captain. So it raises a question as to where we will go from here in future seasons as to whether Saru will be in command or it will be Burnham, and how all of this will play out. But they are sorting out some characters. The episode overall had some reminders of older Star Trek episodes, but it was definitely original for Discovery. I'm of two minds. This overarching story makes everything a big deal every episode. So in other words, the stakes are very high in every episode. The universe is at stake in every episode. And so you get invested in it for that reason, but it's also a little bit exhausting. I certainly missed the one-off adventures that we had with Star Trek The Next Generation, where every week wasn't a life or death situation. I think Discovery has tried to balance that somewhat this season and have a few one-offs, so that's been refreshing. But again, it's going to be harder and harder for the writers to create this kind of situation every season for this crew and have it be believable. They've set a very high bar for themselves, and we'll have to see how that plays out as the series moves forward. For now, this episode was one for free, 2-1 to see. It's still far better for me than the first two seasons. A little bit of a strange turn. I'm not sure how I feel about it, but I think the next 2 episodes will certainly bolster that for me as far as liking it or disliking it.
See what I did there?
Oh, Daddy.